Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. This time we have a returning guest who's it's been quite a while since he's been on the last time, and last time was the 2nd December 2021. We discussed the fall of Constantinople, but this week we are back to be having back to discuss his recent book Spice, which I'm holding up here, and which is about the 16th century contest that shaped the modern world. And I don't think there will be giant worms in this one. I'm sorry, I just had to make the Dune reference there. But tell us how this book came about and how you got into the Spanish trade, because last time like I said, we discussed the fall of Constantinople, and this is quite different subject from the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Thanks for firstly, Erlend, thanks very much for inviting me along. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, where did this story come from? Well, I wrote a book about the Portuguese exploration of the world about two or 3 years back. And the Portuguese got as far as the Malay Peninsula by about 1510. And they captured Malacca, which was a key trading hub on the coast of Malaysia. And at this point, I realized that this was kind of the springboard for a further adventure into the Far East. So this book is really a continuation of the last book, Conquerors, and follows really the contest between Portugal and Spain to reach and control the spice trade. And nowadays, it's really quite difficult for us to understand quite how important spices were to people of the late Middle Ages. They have a long history of presence in world history. You can go back to the valleys of the Euphrates and find spices in ancient cities. The Chinese had spices. Spices came to Europe at a fantastically high price because they passed through the hands of very many middlemen. It's still difficult for us to understand why they were so valued. And there were various kind of things around spices that, they were analgesics. They protected you against illness and so on. But generally, I think that spices just cheered up rather dull food. So 1511, the Portuguese have got to Malacca. And at that point, they're getting information about where spices come from. Marco Polo had ideas, but they realized that the spice trade originated somewhere further east. And that was the start of this book.
I want to talk a little bit before we go into 1510. I want to talk a little bit about the spice trade before the gods start exploring the the Far East, and they talk a little bit about how before the age of exploration, that how spices were traded with late medieval Europe.
They were traded through the hands of many middlemen, effectively across the Indian Ocean. A lot of these were Islamic merchants, and you can relate the spread of Islam to the trading across the Indian Ocean. This depended upon, it was seasonal, depending upon the monsoons, and it would have passed through many hands from Malacca through to Goa and cities on the west coast of India, then across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, and then by camel to Cairo, and then from Cairo up to Alexandria, where Venetian and Genoese merchants would come and buy. And of course, with each hand that the spices passed through, the price went up. So what might have cost 1 unit at source back in the Spice Islands was 1,000 times, the cost was 1,000 times greater by the time they got to Europe. So they're massively valuable and extremely expensive, rarity commodity. And they were at times as valuable as gold. They're the ideal long distance product because they're quite lightweight, and they survive long voyages really quite well. They don't corrupt uh, so badly because they're a dried out product. So they're the ideal get rich product. And as I said, they were influential in developing the whole culture of the Indian Ocean, with merchants going backwards and forth between Africa and the west coast of India and so on. So this is a great linking chain. And really, the people of Europe had very little idea where they came from until the Portuguese started to identify them at the start of the 16th century.
Let's talk a little bit about the Portuguese in India and how they came. I'm not sure if dominate is the right word, but how they came to trade with the spices in the Indian Ocean, and how of course the Spanish eventually got involved as well.
The Portuguese made their way around Africa in 1498 with Vasco da Gama, and they reached the coast of India. And they started trading in pepper there. The Portuguese were monopolists. They wanted to try and control the whole of the Indian Ocean, rather ambitious attempt. And obviously this involved quite a lot of warfare. There's something of the conquistador mentality in the Portuguese. They were the only people in the shipping in the Indian Ocean that had fast-firing cannons. So they managed to get control of quite a lot of this. And but at each point that they reach, they were great sources of gatherers of information. So when they get to Goa, they meet merchants from further down the coast, and eventually they reach Malacca, which is a critical point on the west coast of the Malaysian Peninsula, a sort of trade hub. There are regional trade hubs all the way along the route, from Cairo through to Goa, through to Malacca. And this is what brought the Portuguese there. And it was almost as if they saw the world unfolding in front of them. And for every step they took, they wanted to take another step and another step and another step. So the launch pad really for them when they get to Malacca in 1511 is they start to meet merchants coming from further east, Chinese merchants who, provide information about the sailing routes beyond. And it's really the first European direct contact since Marco Polo with the Chinese. The first recorded use of chopsticks actually happens with the Portuguese in Malacca. Marco Polo, strangely never mentioned them. This is how they got to the point where they could launch an expedition. They had gathered the information. They had got the services of local pilots to take a number of ships further east to go and find the sources of the two key things, which are cloves and nutmeg.
Was it because of the spice trade that Columbus decided to sail the other way around to be able to compete with the Portuguese and trying to say better and quicker trade routes?
Yes, it was one of several, but there exists an annotated copy of Marco Polo's travels, which was owned by Columbus, and in it he noted or had written pearls, gold, and spices. So there was this general idea of the richness of the Orient, and Marco Polo's travels really sits behind all this as a kind of, something that whetted the appetite of Europeans. But spices are definitely a critical part of Columbus's agenda.
And I want to talk about the Spanish, and I want to talk about as well just a second. I need to Francisco Serrao, of course, and how he came into the picture.
Francisco Serrao was Portuguese merchant, and he was um, he was a friend of Magellan or Magalhães, who was actually Portuguese, and he had letters from Magellan talking about the spice trade, and this was the inspiration for him to set out. There were 3 ships set out with pilots, and they make their way to the islands of the Spice Islands. There are 2 groups really. One of the islands called the Bandas, which is the only place in the world where nutmeg grew, and the other were the islands called the Moluccas. 5 small islands were the only places in the world where cloves grew. There's an extraordinary evolutionary story around these islands. This is a laboratory of evolution. This archipelago, the Indonesian and Philippine archipelago. Magellan, or Magalhães, as he was called, transferred his allegiance to Spain because he thought the job prospects were better. And so it's under the flag of Spain that he sets out with a fleet in 1519 to make the voyage to try and reach the Spice Islands. And this is a colossal piece of navigation. They have to sail down the coast of America. Nobody knows if there is a barrier through the Americas that will take them into the Pacific Ocean, but they do find this channel at the bottom of South America, which is now called the Straits of Magellan. They make it into the Pacific Ocean. This is an extraordinarily arduous voyage. The great danger for all sailors for long distances was scurvy. If they don't get enough vitamin C, they die. But they do make it to the Philippines. Magellan is actually killed there, but Juan Sebastian Elcano, who was sort of like second in command, makes it to the Spice Islands. And at this point, the Portuguese, who are coming from the east, from the west, and the Spanish coming from the east, meet on these tiny islands, the Malacca Islands. And what follows is a sort of 30 or 40-year micro war fought by Europeans on these tiny islands for control of the spice trade. It's an extraordinary story because the Spanish would send out regular fleets after the Magellan expedition had charted a route. And in time, actually, they would start sending them from the coast of Mexico. So there's a sort of micro war being fought between these 2 Iberian neighbors, Portugal and Spain, on the other side of the world, in these tiny islands, to try and get control of the spice trade.
Were the colonial mindset yet set into the Europeans, such as Portuguese, that they wanted to control the islands, or they control the space? Was there kind of a colonial mindset already, or would that come later?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Was there a kind of colonial mindset already set inside of the Spanish and the Portuguese, or were it just trade? Was that the main focus there of the Portuguese and the Spanish?
Well, I think ownership was certainly part of their agenda. I mean, both the Spanish and the Portuguese are keen on producing cartography with their flags on the islands. So they wanted to own these islands, and obviously to the detriment of the local people. So it's both, really. It's both. Obviously, they want the trade, but they want monopoly trade. Both sides. So both sides built forts on these islands. These are markers of possession, and claimed them for their kings. So it is colonial as well as economic. You can see, if you look at maps of this period, you know, the flag of Spain and the flag of Portugal being put on their maps and claiming them either for the King of Portugal or for the King of Spain. So it's both things, really.
Let's talk about the Spanish back home as well, and how they would, because they, as we talked about, there were communications back and forth, but it took tremendous amount of time just because they didn't have even steership or the Suez Canal yet, or the technology we have today. So let's talk a little bit about how communications back and forth between these Spice Islands and the homeland went worked out.
It's incredibly slow, it has to be said. Um, it's kind of like a sort of 2-year job sending a message back and forth. What the Spanish worked out really quickly that the Straits of Magellan going around South America was so tough. It was such a difficult voyage. It was so cold. Um, the shipwreck statistics very high that they worked out, if you like, a swifter route, which was to send ships from Seville to uh, effectively where the Panama Canal is, to a city called Veracruz, then to have goods carried across the isthmus about 70 miles onto the Pacific coast, and then from Acapulco on to the Spice Islands, and they started shipbuilding, building ships in the Pacific on the coast of Acapulco. The problem that they had, and it took them quite a long time to sort this out, was they could sail west easily across the Pacific. It was an easy ride. The steady wind just carried them across at a certain speed.
But going home, however,
Sorry.
was a different matter.
Well, it was they couldn't get back. It was like sailing into a lobster pot. They could get in there, and there were about 4 expeditions that tried to sail back, and they repeatedly got blown back to the Spice Islands. It was a one-way ticket, extraordinary, and so they'd end up in the Spice Islands. The Portuguese would capture them, repatriate them on their own ships back to Lisbon, and it took a long time. It took about 30 years. And there was one guy who solved this problem. He was a Basque from northern Spain, a guy, and he's sort of unknown in world history, but he's actually very important, called Andres de Urdaneta. Urdaneta had gone out with the Magellan fleet, and he'd been sort of dumped on the islands, on the Moluccan Islands, and he lived there for about 12 years. And very bright guy, and he worked out how the pattern of the winds of the Pacific winds worked. And eventually, he actually had given up exploring and retreated into a monastery in Mexico. The King of Spain, Charles, begged him to go on an expedition and solve this problem. And so they, in 1560s, they set out with a fleet of ships, and the sole aim of this was to pioneer a route back to Mexico. And Urdaneta has it pretty well worked out. So you have to sail north up towards Japan at the right time of year, then you pick up a wind and you get carried back again. And this cracked the problem of Pacific navigation. And this was actually incredibly important for the Spanish, and also for the global flow of commodities, because now the Spanish could send ships across the Pacific. In time, they set up a city, or took a city of Manila in the Philippines. And this became a massive trade hub for goods from the Spice Islands, from China and Japan. And every year, at the right time of the year, they would send 2 enormous trade ships back from Manila, the Manila galleons, that would go laden with spices, gold, all the produce of trade hubs of the Far East, on the route that Urdaneta had discovered back to Acapulco. And then these goods would be carried to Mexico City. And this was kind of like linking up while the Portuguese were carrying goods back west through the Indian Ocean, round Africa. The Spanish were now carrying goods back east across the Pacific Ocean, across Mexico, and then back into Europe. So in terms of this extraordinary moment, because you've now got a completely connected trade system that encompasses the whole world, a great mesh of shipping lines, of opportunities for trade, and then you start to see all kinds of produce kind of coming back out of the Far East, out of China, out of Japan, and going the other way. So, by the middle of the 16th century, you could order a dinner set from China, Ming pottery in Europe. You could buy goods from Japan, and things go the other way. The Portuguese introduced firearms into Japan. There's a movement of crop species around the world going on as a consequence of this. It's an incredibly important moment in world trade history, and this trade really gets going with China when the Spanish discover huge quantities of silver
Excuse me.
in the mountains of Peru. And what the Chinese want is silver, because they change their tax system. And so we start to see Europeans piling silver into China and buying the manufactured goods of China. And in a sense, it's then as now, where Europeans send money to China and buy the very desirable goods of China, which were pottery, silk, all kinds of manufactured goods.
As of today, of course, it's iPhones, computers, or technological goods that we buy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but this is a very important moment in world history, really, and the spice thing, which brought people in, with the, if you like, the bait that took people into the Far East. And then you get an explosion of all kinds of things going on. I mean, you get, diseases spreading around more easily. You get the Portuguese introduce new crops into China, which will improve the diet of the Chinese, and there will be a population boom in China in the 18th century. All things arise out of this magnetic pull of Europeans into the further east. It is an extraordinary story, and one of the great things about this really is that we've entered the age of printing in the 16th century, and a huge amount of information about the Far East. People start writing more. I think more books were printed in the second half of the 16th century than they reckon all the writing that ever been done in the world before, in 50 years. So there's an explosion of knowledge within Europe, certainly, about, and we get travelers traveling into China, seeing, extraordinary kind of civilization, which in many respects was much more advanced.
Missionaries as well, I imagine, started coming.
Yes, missionaries were certainly the first point of entry, trying to convert to the Chinese to Christianity. They didn't have very much success, and quite often came to brutal ends. But and it certainly took them, and it took the Portuguese a while to understand the protocols of China. When the Portuguese first turned up, they thought they could that they could make direct contact with the Ming emperor. Our king would like to talk to you, through us to your king, but it doesn't work like that in China. There is only subordination, and it took them quite a while and some fairly ghastly massacres of Portuguese people before they realized, that the rules are different in China. China is the central kingdom. Everything else is peripheral. Everything else is inferior. And so, but you're right, you start to see people writing incredibly detailed accounts of what China had, the way that their extraordinary rivers, their extraordinary canal system, their inventions they had, and it was, a place of wonder of the industriousness of China, their ingenuity, all sorts of things that they'd invented, thousands of years ago. The wheelbarrow, a device for pumping out ships, which involved one man with a treadmill working a wheel in the ship. European ships, you had men cranking things, which was actually much less efficient. So you're starting to get this information from China as part of the explosion of knowledge about the use. At the same time, the Portuguese make it to Japan, and the Jesuits actually are extraordinarily successful in conversion of of Japanese people to Christianity. There's hundreds of thousands, until the point when the Japanese feel that their culture is being undermined, and then there's a massacre, and the Portuguese missionaries are expelled. But they had a great deal of success there. They had no success in China at all.
You mentioned sexual diseases came, and of course, I want to talk a little bit about that as well, because we didn't, as I said earlier about technology, we didn't have medical, and this is a bit true, of course, in India, British India as well, up until fairly early 20th century. But well, let's talk a little bit about the death rates of the soldiers and traders coming into the Far East, and how the mortality rate were in the 16th century.
Yeah. They said of the Portuguese, a small people with the whole world to die in. And Vasco da Gama dies in India. Magellan is actually killed in a battle which he shouldn't have fought in the Philippines. But the mortality rate is extraordinary. When Magellan sets out, 285, something like 285 men on 4 ships. 19 men make it back again. The dangers of certainly, the voyage itself, scurvy, the lack of vitamin C, that huge voyage across the Pacific Ocean would do for a lot of people. But malnutrition, all sorts of causes.
Sexual diseases, I imagine, as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think the Portuguese probably introduced syphilis into the Far East, and I think it's difficult to get your head around the mentality of people. When Magellan's 19 men come back again and come ashore in Seville barefoot, looking like ghosts, 4 of these people sign up to take the voyage again another time, and you think, what is going on here? Why are they doing this? And these people are different from us, but I think the lure of wealth and of we certainly see all kinds of diseases spreading around the world as a result of you know, of movements of peoples. And I mean, the Black Death, you know, comes out of Central Asia via the Black Sea, via the Venetians and the Genoese a couple of hundred years earlier. So yes, there's definitely quite there is a very high death rate between the people who go, and
but
certainly,
were there as well diseases that came from the local population that were transmitted into the Portuguese and the Spanish as well, or were there not? But were there not so much diseases in Asia at the time that were transmittable to the Portuguese and the Spanish?
that's an interesting one, and I have to say I don't really know the answer. But as far as China and um,
Because we read about the other way around, that was there also from there must have been some coming back from the Asian population.
yeah. I don't know the answer to that as far as the islands are concerned, or China. Um, the devastation, of course, happens in the Americas, where people are wiped out by European diseases. In whole populations, the Caribs disappear. You know, millions of people die of influenza, but there's not a large population of Europeans in the Far East. I mean, these people are traders. The hubs that do arrive are Manila, where I think possibly there were periods in which disease struck the population, but I'm afraid I can't really remember exactly which of the many pathogens this was. So I can't really answer your question beyond that. It's an interesting one. Yeah.
And another thing I want to talk a little bit about as well is have a lot of trade on spices, but as well as you see with the Aztec countries, to do a comparison here, they bring a lot of the local population from the Aztecs into Spain and into Europe. That would be a marvel for the Europeans to see. Was there same with the Asian population, where the Asian population that were say then married to local Portuguese or Spanish traders and soldiers that were brought back into Europe? And do we know if they were trading people as well as spices?
Um, the the Portuguese are great mixed marriages, actually, and you do get these Creole populations, but generally, yeah, I mean, bringing people back was part of the sort of collecting, the horrible way to put it, ethnographic specimens was something that all the voyagers did, as long as the people survived, was a proof that you'd been. But there's no, there's a vast influx of people from Africa being enslaved into the Americas. I mean, there's something like 20,000 Africans in Mexico City in the middle of the 16th century, but there's not much movement of these enslaved Africans into the Far East, and I don't think beyond the occasional local person that there's much enslavement of people in the archipelagos of the Philippines or Indonesia back into Europe. These are mainly trading posts rather than, there's no large plantation stuff going on in these islands. It's not like the Americas. So in terms of, I mean, you do get weird DNA ends up in most extraordinary places. And all sorts of people get moved around the world. And, you know, for example, there is um, there is Basque DNA in the Pacific Islands, quite probably because one of the Spanish ships got blown off course, and these guys finish up on a small island somewhere in the South Pacific. So you're getting this kind of random scattering of people and human DNA. But the real movement of DNA is happening really between Africa and the Americas. Really, the plantation slavery. There isn't plantation slavery in the small islands of the. Of course, the thing that's barricading this actually is that getting to the Far East for the first time, Europeans come in contact in China and Japan with highly developed, highly sophisticated societies, and they're suddenly confronted with societies which are, in many respects, superior to their own, and so you're not going to see very much opportunity for for capturing people and taking them away and so on.
Mm. Well, as we will see, of course, and again, another comparison in British India a few centuries later, we see at least early in the start of British India, we see the British kind of integrated into the Indian society and intermarrying with local Indian women and taking mistresses as such. So we see this as well, that the traders and soldiers intermarry with the local population, and do we see if they kind of go into develop the culture that they have, that they kind of like the white noodles in a way. Do we see this happening as well in the early 16th century?
Yes, you do, and I mean the Portuguese, I think, are the kind of the front runners in this. I mean, it starts in Goa for the Portuguese because um, the, um, the Portuguese realize that 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 in their voyages, no women are going. It's just men, and when you get men in local populations, you get trouble, and therefore, much to the displeasure of the papacy, they allowed intermarriage, and so you get these sort of what you might call Creole societies, mixed societies, and this would have gone on further and further into the east. That a lot of these Portuguese, I mean, they settled down and intermarried, um, uh, and the Spanish as well. I mean, the Portuguese, of course, managed to get a little settlement on the coast of China at Macau, um, and so they go native really, and a lot of these people really go they go for a better life, and they're quite happy to settle down in Manila or Macau and intermarry, and never go back to their home country. So um, so you don't get. I mean, obviously, later on in the Raj in India, the kind of this intermarriage thing becomes more frowned upon, I think. But you definitely get a very mixing of people and so on as a result of settling. People go to settle. And initially they went to trade, but then they went to settle and they went to live here, and these were their homes, and there are still Portuguese who regard Macau as their home now, although they're under some pressure from the Chinese government. So these people go and they do not come back. They live there. They live their lives out there.
We talked a little bit about the wars with Spanish and the Portuguese earlier on, but were there other dangers when you travel back with goods back from Asia, Philippines, and they were like a strait back to Europe where the dangers like pirates or privateers that were could no were the other dangers other than the Portuguese or the Spanish. And I'm not sure if don't remember if the British are at the scene at this time, but were the dangers of privateers and pirates at this time when going back to Europe.
Yes, of course. It takes quite a long time for anybody else to turn up in the Pacific Ocean. But Francis Drake, in 1580, makes the third navigation of the world through the Magellan Straits, and he these Manila galleons, which are kind of like floating, treasure ships. He captures one of these, and he comes back to Britain with a sort of 2,000% return on the investment. Other British ships turn up in the 18th century. A man called Anson captures some treasure ships in the 1720s, and the parade through the streets of London of these carts full of treasure are kind of an extraordinary thing. But it's not easy to be a pirate in the Indian Ocean because you have to sail right round the Americas. But the people who do turn up, yeah, certainly there is there's extraordinary tales to this. The other thing is that there's actually quite a high of these Manila galleons, which are kind of like the treasure ships of all time. There's quite a high, despite the fact that they pioneered this route, quite high shipwreck statistics, and there's quite a lot of wealth at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, which occasionally, maritime treasure hunters go and dig up now or try and find, because the ships were very heavily laden, and very often they have very strict rules about how much stuff you could put on the ship, but because everybody was trying to make money, very often these ships would be overloaded, or they discover that the water, they're halfway across, that the water casks, which were meant to be full of water, weren't full of water at all. They were full of silk and stuff that people were going to sell. And therefore, the ships sometimes were just actually too heavy laden, and then they were in danger of sinking. So the shipwreck statistics of the Manila galleons are actually quite high. And the dreams of people finding the seabed strewn with, Spanish gold, it's still out there.
I want to end with a question about I thought it's just the legacy of the 16th century spice trade and how and we obviously spoke a lot about this kind of already, but still, what would you say is the legacy of the 16th century spice trade?
The legacy is, I think, twofold. Firstly, a genuine development of world trade, that goods can now flow around the world, conquering the Pacific Ocean, tied up, so that the flow of goods could travel in all directions. I think that's the first one, and I think the second one is that the explosion of knowledge about the world that is gained in this. The famous historian David Abulafia, British historian, just calls this the age of acceleration, and the acceleration of knowledge about the world, which comes from exploration, development of printing, cartography, trading mechanisms, ways in which people can, financial institutions and devices for transmitting goods, paying for them, and so on. uh, awareness of worlds beyond the world in which people lived was this all ties up, I think, with the Renaissance. Really, suddenly we know a great deal more by 1600 than we knew by 1500 about the world. Map making becomes incredibly sophisticated. We see you can now you could now conjure the world. You could hold a globe in your hand and see the world as an entity. And this, from the European point of view, is extraordinary. And certainly, the consequences that go on from this are ripple in all directions. For the great civilizations of the Far East, Japan and China, they remain, if you like, unviolated because they can simply repel the Europeans, but they also gain and things change for them. I mean, in terms of, as I said, in terms of crop species that increase populations in China, they also get less desirable things like tobacco, and then they're going to get opium. The Japanese get firearms for a while, although in the end they give them up. And then their knowledge of the world is amplified a bit, but they remain pretty much themselves, until we get into the 19th century. So really, it's global trade and it's knowledge of the world in which we live. It's climates, it's peoples, ethnography, biology, all kinds of stuff accelerates in this century.
Whether also Chinese traders going to Europe the other way around, or whether more or less they didn't let the trade go to the Europeans.
Not really. They went as far as Malacca, and stopped there. Of course, they had their opportunity in the 15th century when this great Ming fleet sailed around the Indian Ocean, led by a Chinese admiral whose name I can't pronounce. And they demonstrated they were quite capable of sailing around the world, but China introverted in the Ming period and really stopped expanding. So they really remained centralized, and I don't know much about Chinese individuals making it into Europe. I don't, I think it would. There must have been some, but I think it was pretty rare.
Hmm. I think we've done a round enough there. Thank you again so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you again. Of course, if people want to know more on the 16th century spice trade, because we only touched the tip of the iceberg in this episode, where can people buy your book, Spice, the 16th century contest that shaped the modern world? Where can people find your book? And of course, where can the other books that you read as well?
Thank you very much, Erlend. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Do you have any social media, anything you want to share below, and the links in the description that you want, where can people find you if they have further questions about the spice trade? Do you have anything you want to promote? Right, let's do forgive me. I do have a cold still, so do forgive me if I'm a bit difficult to understand today. But do you have anything else you want to promote, or links you want me to share, social media, etc., or etc., anything else?
I'm not sure.
This has been Well That Aged Well. Of course, I would recommend to check out our other episode as well, where we discuss the 1453, the fall of Constantinople. And I highly recommend checking out other episodes that I made. I'm sure you'll find something that you like. This has been Well That Aged Well. You can find us on Twitter/X under Well That Aged Well. And you can find us on Instagram under Well That Aged Well, where I will share episodes as well. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. If you like this episode, that would help us out a lot. If you are an Apple Podcast, write a review and tell us whether you liked or hate this podcast. I would preferably read if you love this podcast. But it's a free world, at least this part of the world. So you can write whatever you want. It doesn't even have to be about this podcast. We are, of course, on YouTube as well, and we're not aged well. Please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.